Could you recognize if someone you loved was a victim of abuse or the one causing it? Abuse often lurks in plain sight, camouflaged amidst chaos and drama. It thrives when we close our eyes to the stories we deem too perplexing or overwhelming. This is how victim stories are dismissed, and why we began this work. If I Told You is a project sharing about hidden abuses and concealed horrors happening to unexpected people in unexpected situations. Our team represents their stories to you to help you understand them better through the lens of faith and science. As you listen, we hope you think deeper, listen with compassion, and are pushed to action.
Hey there, listeners. Elle here. Welcome back to If I Told You, a podcast born out of one night that exposed abuse and deception in my home, a system that failed to protect my children, and the 4-year fight that followed to tell the truth about abuse, especially the truths others work hardest to hide. If this is your first time listening, I encourage you to start at Season 1, Episode 1, Tell Me What Happened, where I share the night that changed everything. And if you have been walking the story with me, let's keep going. I need to say this before we begin. This next episode is dizzying. I'm still piecing parts of it together myself, and I need you to stay with me, stay focused, and keep track of the details. The months you're about to hear were a blur of events, encounters, names, and moments that didn't make sense at the time, but were all important. Each encounter matters, not always for who they were individually, but for what they represent. When we left off, I was leaving the only place I had known since arriving in South Africa. No plan, only obedience. And at the time, it felt like survival, like God was telling me to get up and go before something closed in. But here's the truth I didn't understand yet. Leaving didn't end the battle, it only changed the terrain. This episode is about what happens when the clock turns again, and the threats are no longer abstract. In the midst of grief and displacement, I began to notice something else entirely. Patterns, interruptions, people showing up at precise moments, not random, not accidental, and definitely not neutral. This is the episode where I begin to ask a terrifying question. What if some of the people who crossed my path weren't just there, but sent to distract, sent to delay, sent to harm, or to reveal? Because once the battlefield shifts, discernment is no longer optional. Before I tell you who showed up, there's something that you need to understand first. Because what you will hear next isn't random. Everything that occurs followed a pattern. And once you see that pattern, the rest of this episode will make sense. What do you think happens when you speak the truth, like in the case concerning my daughter, or when you are coming against what appears to be a network of people? Well, in the enemy's camp, you are pegged as a threat just because you told the truth, just because you saw something clearly and refused to compromise. And when this happens, the enemy doesn't respond emotionally, he responds strategically. I believe everything after November 16th, 2023, the day that my children were taken, marked the beginning of the enemy's strategy. When a truth teller refuses to comply or becomes a liability, the enemy tries to remove them, eliminate the person entirely. Now, this can be physical, or it can be reputational. Smear them, tell lies about them. It can be relational, cut off their friends and their support. And if removal happens, the threat ends. And when it's a physical removal, it's very rarely direct. It's usually through some secondary means. Person goes through a custody case and then has an unexpected heart attack or a freak accident. Nothing that points to anyone and nothing that raises questions. But sometimes removal of someone doesn't go as the enemy planned. Because there are those of us who are truly covered by God. And so when removal fails, the enemy's strategy changes. He tries to covenant you. When the enemy covenants you, it's an attempt to initiate you into an agreement. If it's overt, it usually looks obvious. It's like getting you to willingly join a secret society or some sort of brotherhood. If it is covert, it's a hidden initiation done without the target knowing that it's happening. That can be through gifts, sex, or money. It is the spiritual equivalent of if you can't beat them, force them to join you. Now, why would a network or a brotherhood want to do this? Because covenanting or initiating someone binds a person to the same codes of silence, loyalty, and consequences as the network itself. It also subjects that person to punishment if those codes are violated. But far worse, if it is a true believer who turns away from God and ignorantly does this, even unknowingly, they aren't just aligning with the enemy. They are now standing in opposition to God himself. And the enemy knows that God's judgment is far more severe than anything the enemy could ever inflict directly. That's why covert or forced initiation is attempted. The goal is still to remove you, but through bringing judgment down on the person without ever touching them. So when trying to covenant someone fails, the enemy shifts strategy again. The objective becomes to distress or to eventually defile the person. Distressing is easy to understand. You isolate the person, you take away their friends, you take away their support systems, you take away their children. You exhaust them so badly that they no longer want to go on. You pull them down so far into grief and sorrow that they begin to doubt God, lose faith, lose focus, and start entertaining thoughts planted by the enemy himself. You know God doesn't love you. You know he's not with you. You should have just stayed quiet. You should have found another way out. And this is where the removal of my children becomes so central. Their being taken from me was isolating. It was grieving. Plainly said, it was horrifying. And if there was ever a temptation to doubt God, it was then. Daniel 7:25 says it best. The enemy shall speak words against the Most High, and he shall wear out the saints. And finally, if he can't distress you, he will defile you. It's like in Numbers 25, when Balaam and Balak couldn't curse the Israelites, so they brought women as a temptation to sin. Because then God himself would bring judgment, or worse, it would lead to them walking away from God entirely. So one by one, the enemy attempts all of this. He tries to take you out. He tries to covenant you or curse you. He tries to distress you, and he tries to defile you. And he keeps trying all of them, waiting to see which one will work. This is the frame for this episode and for this season. It is peeling back the layers of a strategy from hell to continue a battle that really didn't end on that day. And looking back now, the enemy had each of these strategies on rotation. The easiest way to execute all of this was to keep me stuck in one place, limit my movement, control my environment, and then introduce people one by one, each playing a role, whether they knew it or not, all with the same objective. What you're about to hear may sound dizzying, not because it's chaotic, but because that's what it felt like to live inside of it. One person would become two would become several, and I would eventually understand that these people were not random. This is episode 2. They were sent. And as you listen, pay attention, because what matters most isn't simply who was sent, it's why. Because when you speak for truths that others want you to ignore, what appears next is never accidental.
This podcast discusses serious and often distressing topics. If you find yourself in need of support at any time, please contact your local crisis center or reach out to our support resources.
We began this story with a mother fighting for her children, fighting to protect them, fighting to stop what never should have touched them. Don't lose that thread. We like to believe that standing for what's right brings protection, that righteousness gathers support. But Scripture tells a harder truth. Sometimes when you stand for good, you aren't applauded. You're pursued, watched, studied, surrounded. Not always to destroy you outright, but to distract you, to entangle you in chaos, to pull you into a side story so consuming you forget the original fight. Because if the enemy can't silence you, he'll try to reroute you. If he can't stop the truth, he'll try to discredit the messenger. So pay attention now. How did a mother's fight for her children turn into danger in a foreign land? What happens next doesn't negate the mission, it confirms it. And what you're about to hear is where the pursuit begins.
I didn't know then that leaving wouldn't bring safety. I thought that obedience brought distance from that guy, from the danger, and from whatever else he might be involved with. But sometimes escape doesn't end the retreat. Sometimes it just activates the next phase of it. Once I made the decision to leave, things fell into place like clockwork, it feels like. Now, at the time, I would have called that alignment, but looking back, I wonder if it was something else entirely, an orchestration that I just didn't understand, carrying me forward before I could stop to question where it was actually leading me. That day, I packed up my belongings quickly and I called for a taxi. I remember I requested a large car so I could get all of my things inside easily. But what came was the most compact sedan that I had ever seen, and its trunk was already half filled with some of the driver's belongings. I remember I looked at him, looked at the car, and remembered, how many bags I had. And I said, I have 10 minutes to leave, and all of this has to fit in that somehow. He looked at me and just cracked a smile and said, "Shop, shop." He put a thumbs up and began loading my bags. Even now, there's no way to explain how everything I had fit in that car. Again, at the time, I would have called it alignment. Later, I would start to question whether ease always means safety. So we're driving down the highway and I just kept praying under my breath, God, if this is you leading me, or if I'm being led by something that I don't yet understand, please stay with me. Don't let me go. Don't stop speaking to me. As we neared my new apartment, the driver then veered off the main road to a set of smaller, narrower residential streets. And as I stared out the window, I realized that the road looked familiar. I hadn't driven that way when I was touring the apartment, but I knew this road. I started paying attention to every building, every driveway, and then suddenly I knew why. This was the same road from that night where Teppo and his friend were. I pulled up my GPS quickly and realized that we weren't far from my new place at all. And that's when I realized something I hadn't seen before. These areas were connected closely. I hadn't known the layout of the area well enough to understand how easily one bled into the other. Had I just left one fire only to jump into another fire? I remember that moment. My chest became so tight and I felt like I could have vomited right there in the car. Whatever sounds I was making, it made the driver look back at me through the rearview mirror, and he was like, "No worries, we're almost there." Almost there. He thought I was worried about getting there on time for something, but he had no idea that those were the last words that I wanted to hear. We pulled up to my new building and I collected the keys, and between the driver and myself, we unloaded everything really quickly. By the time we were done, I felt like I was working on adrenaline alone. When everything was offloaded, I closed my apartment door and I literally just lay down in bed, fully clothed. I remember praying that night because I still felt so uncertain by the proximity of what I felt like I was trying to get away from. And I said, "Lord, help me see what's next. Help me keep seeing what you're doing." And then I slept off. Have you ever been in a moment where it felt like God and the enemy were saying the same thing, but for very different reasons? Here's what I'm saying. It felt like God was clearly saying, this person is not safe. What has happened so far has already been destructive in ways you can't see. Cut it off, leave this place. And at the same time, it felt like the enemy was also pushing movement, creating pressure and urgency and disruption because he knew there was already a command to move. That's the tension I was sitting in that day. It reminds me of the story of Ezra and the exiles returning to Jerusalem. God had clearly told them to go, to rebuild, to return home. And yet scripture tells us that the threat of enemies and bandits along the road was very real enough that Ezra declared a fast before they set out. I don't think that was a lack of faith at all. I think that was discernment. Because when God gives a command to move, the enemy hears it too. And often the attack doesn't come before the move. It comes at the move, at the point of transition, at the point of vulnerability, the place you've been led into. That was exactly where I was. Within that first week, I had 2 dreams that deeply unsettled me. The first came after a long night of prayer, and the dream I had came in the early morning hours, around 3 or 4 a.m. In that dream, I was lying in my bed in that new apartment, asleep, when suddenly I heard the sound of someone trying to open my bedroom door. I sat straight up in bed in the dream, staring at the door, and my heart was pounding. And I'm staring there, waiting to see who or what was on the other side. Then the door opened. In walked a heavy-set man who was quietly humming to himself, as if he were casually entering a place he had been many times before, as if this was routine, familiar, and normal to him. In the dream, I stared at him in shock. When he looked up and realized that I was awake watching him, he froze, mid-step and mid-motion, as if standing still might make me disappear or make me just go back to sleep. In the dream, I remember wanting to pray, and I could feel the sound of the prayers rising through my chest, through my throat. I could feel my spirit also pushing me to wake up fully so that I could actually pray. And then I woke up in real life, literally shouting prayers and praying in tongues. It felt as though I had been allowed to see something that had already been happening, a glimpse into the spiritual realm, not an attack that was beginning, but a presence that had already been operating. What disturbed me the most from that dream wasn't just that someone entered, it was how casually this thing did it. The humming, the ease, as though whatever this was had been watching for some time and had grown comfortable. I remember that morning my spirit feeling so grieved with what I had seen. This, to me, represented a monitoring spirit, one that had become comfortable in monitoring in the spirit realm, and it was by God's grace that He had revealed that. One of the things about Scripture where it says God reveals to redeem. And so I really sat with that dream. And as I sat with it, my thoughts raced through the previous months in South Africa. Here I was, alone. I had been grieving. I was spiritually exhausted. I was fasting less than I normally had for the past 3-4 years. I was carrying disappointment and confusion after the outcome with my children. I wondered, had that weariness created vulnerability? Most likely, because if I was compromised in any way, spiritually dull, emotionally depleted, I believe that that doesn't just affect me. It affects my children and how I pray for them. A compromised parent prays differently, sees less clearly, discerns more slowly, especially when it comes to danger around their children. That morning, I remember praying relentlessly, praying without ceasing. I anointed the apartment, I anointed my bedroom, I prayed over my children by name, and I recovenanted myself to God, asking Him to keep my eyes open, my spirit sharp, and to blind the eyes of whatever it was that was watching in the spirit realm. A few nights later, I then had another dream. In this one dream, I was at a social gathering. I remember talking with people, moving through the crowd, and then leaving. After I left, my ex appeared. He began going to the same people I'd just spoken with, asking questions about me, where I had gone, when I had left, which direction I took. Then the dream shifted. It pulled back as if zooming out, and I could suddenly see the building that we had been in, a tall, multi-story structure, a place I recognized only after waking up. At first, I assumed this building was somewhere overseas, a place I had traveled to before, perhaps even in my marriage. That would have made sense to the dream, but something prompted me to look it up. That building wasn't abroad. It was right here in South Africa, near where I was staying. I need you to understand, I had never known that building existed until then. I had never noticed this building in waking life and being around that area. I had never noticed his name. I had never been in that particular part of the complex before. I had never even seen it. I stared at Google Maps for minutes, unmoving. This building that I had just dreamt about, never having heard the name before, was not far from where I was. I stared at Google Maps for minutes, unmoving. What was this dream? I couldn't tell if the dream was a warning or confirmation that something had already begun, especially in light of the previous dream that I just shared with you. The uneasiness that I had from the first dream hadn't lifted, and here we were again, and it still was persisting even more. Where do you go when you've done what God told you to do, and yet the sense of threat remains? If this was the Lord showing me that there was a monitoring spirit, spiritually and possibly physically around me, where else was I supposed to go? I didn't want to act suspicious, but I didn't also want to be reckless. But by then, it was becoming plain to me that God was showing me something very specific, that there was a monitoring presence, spiritual and most likely physical, and calling it that didn't feel strange or out of pocket. Listen, I had just come out of a 3-year battle fighting for the safety of my children, fighting to protect them from a man who was now possibly involved in the occult, an occult where the abuse of children is normalized, an occult where speaking out is punished, an occult that attempts to silence truth tellers through intimidation, humiliation, or worse, an occult that takes its blueprint from the enemy himself, the one who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So when my ex appeared in that second dream, I understand that his presence didn't have to mean him alone necessarily. It could have represented him, or it could have represented whomever he may have now been aligned with. Either way, the message felt the same. Be careful. Watch your movements. And so yes, with only having been in the country for a few months at that point, it naturally made me feel afraid. All of it made me feel afraid. I felt restricted and careful, and I found myself staying close to the new apartment. But I hated the idea that fear might be making my decisions for me. So instead, I treated that season as a reset, a time to listen more closely, to pray more intentionally, to pay attention to everything, and I mean everything that God was trying to show me. Because given the battle I had just come out of, only a fool would ignore what I was sensing and seeing. And so now I'm settling into this new apartment, and every day I'm praying, asking God, show me truth, help me to see what I have not seen. And it's funny because one of the first things he started talking to me about wasn't actually Teppo. It was my father. Let me explain. Now, I didn't say this last episode, but on the day that I knew that I needed money to leave my first apartment in South Africa, I was trying to figure out how to gather the funds for the deposit. And my father calls right in that literal moment. And he asked me, isn't it time for you to move? Don't you need money to do that? The timing of this stopped cold, and let me tell you why. I hadn't told him or anyone that I was planning to move. I hadn't shared details about my living situation. I hadn't even told him about the situation with Teppo. So there would have been no reason for him to know that I needed funds, or to even know that I was thinking about it at that exact moment. Now, sometimes we joke about how parents, especially mothers, have a sixth sense. But my father had never been like that. He was not intuitive in that way, and yet he would appear in precise moments. Other times I would ignore it, but this time it was like God was saying to pay attention. This time felt different. It felt too exact to dismiss. It did not settle right with me, but I didn't yet have the language for it. I didn't know what to call it, only that I noticed it. Then, a few days later, from that call, he called again, this time to offer me a job at his institution. For background, he had already asked me to help him do some work that he was going to be doing in South Africa, ironically. That would be happening a few months after this point. And I agreed to that. But this offer that he was now saying was something different. This job offer on paper sounded ideal. It would mean stable income, working alongside my dad while waiting to hear back regarding the appeals process, and it would have made sense to say yes right away. But something in me hesitated. The timing and the gesture of it all felt so strange. I felt this huge check in my spirit that I could not explain. What God was showing me wasn't just the offer of money. It wasn't just the job. He was drawing my attention to everything, to the totality of my father's involvement since the divorce started and the situation regarding the concern of abuse of my youngest daughter. My father had reemerged in my life in a way that was new. It was different from how our relationship had been previously. And at the time, I just looked at it like provision. He helped me to leave. He helped me think through legal options. He showed up to some of the early court appearances, and he was present with my children whenever he was in town. And I hadn't questioned any of it. Why would I? It looked like support. But now, sitting in that new apartment, asking God to show me truth, God was having me look back over the whole arc, not accusing, just re-examining, because something had shifted. The day that my children were taken in November 2023, my father also changed. He seemed to become unnervingly calm, and that's the best way I can put it. Now, this was the same man who had wept openly during earlier custody exchanges, but not that day. And like my mother, there was no visible distress over my children being gone. It was subtle, and it was 1 degree off, or many degrees off. But once God showed me that, I could not unsee it. And layered beneath all of that was the memory of that earlier warning that I shared from season 1. The vision that someone had shared with me about my father's connection to the car accident involving my children. Not just because he was driving, but as something that could have been masking something darker. Now, all of this, I didn't yet know what it meant. I only knew that God wasn't just asking me to discern new people, but he was asking me to rediscern familiar ones. My focus now shifted to a question I hadn't fully confronted yet. Who really was that guy Teppo? And why did it seem I was so not myself during that time? What kept coming back to me was the sense that I had been under a fog, spiritually and emotionally, like my reactions were delayed and discernment was dulled and slowed. I missed red flags that, looking back, were right in front of me the whole time. Then the Lord brought back a particular conversation. So one afternoon, Teppo told me he had mentioned me to his family. And according to him, because of their status and reputation, they felt the need to look into me further. He said a family member had started asking detailed questions: where I landed, what airport I landed, when I landed, what time, and where I was staying. Questions that felt less curious and more investigative. I kind of pushed back in the moment and I said, well, then who are you then? That's when he launched into a story about his parents and the organizations they were involved in, the pressure he felt to live up to his father's legacy. He said his cousin in particular wanted to dig deeper into me. Then he would ask me about my business. Now, in that moment, my heart did a quick 180 and I froze. It was the same feeling I had in his friend Zani's house when my middle name was mentioned, when my hair was described, a sudden and unmistakable recognition. This feeling of, you shouldn't know this. How do you know this? I had never told him the name of my business or the kind of work I did. never mentioned it. It was nothing nefarious. It was ministry and coaching. And yet, he wasn't asking general questions. He wasn't saying, tell me more about what you do, or how did you get into this? He was asking technical questions. What's your website click-through rate? Where's most of your audience from? These weren't conversational questions. They were analytical ones. At first, I was startled, and I kind of responded, not thinking about it. But then I stopped and asked, well, how do you even know what business I'm in? I've never even told you that. Again, he would brush it off quickly and said that his friend Zani had found it, claimed that he had been looking around and stumbled across it. That didn't make sense. The explanation didn't sit right with me at all. The story about his family investigating me felt honestly contrived, but the business questions, that's where I felt that familiar tension rise in me, that internal conflict between reason and instinct. Again, stupidly, part of me wanted to say, don't overthink this. But another part of me knew something was terribly off. And then came the conversation that changed everything. One afternoon, he brought up my divorce again. Specifically, he asked, is there a reason you think your case lasted so long, for 3 years? I explained as I had before, that I believe that there was occultic involvement, and I believe that whoever was assisting my ex was deliberately dragging it out to buy time, to exhaust me, and to distort the process. He went quiet. Then he said something. You know what your ex sounds like? He sounds like someone who got involved with PPP loans. To be very sincere with you, I laughed out loud. Honestly, it felt absurd. Here I was halfway across the world. I had not heard that term in years, and yet this is some man bringing up to me about PPP loans. I asked him, what do you know about PPP loans? I hadn't even thought about that in years. He dismissed the question and said that, well, news about it had reached everywhere in the world. Then he pivoted and said, I wouldn't be surprised if your ex came into a lot of money, and that's why he wanted your kids. I paused, forcing myself to stay quiet and listen what he was saying. He went further. He said it sounded like my ex had taken out multiple PPP loans in the names of our children. I stopped laughing and forced myself to be still and listen. I asked him directly, are you speculating or are you telling me something? He dodged it and said, I don't know. Maybe I'm telling you, or maybe I'm not. You know that feeling when someone speaks hypothetically, but you can tell that they are actually informing you? That's what this felt like. He repeated the idea and then asked, do your kids have bank accounts? I told him they did. There was some work we'd done as a family and gotten paid for it, and I wanted to set aside a portion for our kids. Just something small to get them started. It wasn't a lot, but it mattered to me. I mentioned it casually, like something I would get to. What stood out was this. Their father had specifically asked twice to handle it himself. That wasn't normal. He didn't usually offer to take initiative on things like that. That afternoon, he said he went to the bank. When he came back, I asked, did you set it up? Did you remember to add me as a co-signer? And he said, no, he didn't. I remember thinking, how do you forget that? Let me pause here because this is important. When you're married and you tell a story like this, people rush to minimize it. Oh, he's just forgetful. Men don't think about details like that. Don't make a big deal out of it. But when you tell the story after the relationship ends, people react very differently. Then it becomes head shakes. Then it becomes, how did you not see that red flag? Then it becomes the list of what they would have done. And I think we need to sit in that tension for a moment. Because for women living inside relationships where passive aggression is the norm, a pattern develops. Certain things don't get done, not accidentally, but consistently, usually in ways that undermine trust, security, or shared responsibility. And over time, you acclimate. Not because you want to, but because you're told it's not serious enough to confront. that you are overreacting, that forgiveness means forgetting, that love means not keeping score. And whether the issue is control, deception, or something darker, their strategy, the abuser's strategy, depends on this, that you will let it slide, that you will doubt yourself, and that you will absorb the cost quietly. That's how patterns like this survive, right, in plain sight. But let's get back to the story. I told him that story and he said, yeah, he probably didn't want you on the account. What if he was using that account to deposit PPP loans? Honestly, I didn't respond. It felt like everything he was saying was so out of my framework and thinking that I didn't even know what to say. And I was sitting in that tension of, is he telling me something or is he really being hypothetical? And then he took it further. He said that, in his opinion, that it wasn't just my children's father involved. He suggested there could be others, friends or family involved. His words, his theory, and his assertions. He began speculating. What if those people had all done the same thing? What if loans had been taken out in the names of their children? And then he said something that made me stop internally. He started calculating, accurately, how much that would be per child, almost as if he already knew who and how many people could be involved, how many children could have been used. Then he went on to say that all of the money could have been consolidated into one large trust, so it wouldn't be traceable to one person. That, or it had been dispersed among multiple people, left untouched long enough to sit quietly over time. And my question remained, how would he know how many people could be involved? We hadn't talked about who surrounded my children's father. I hadn't shared details about extended family. And yet, he was speaking with a level of specificity that didn't feel hypothetical. As someone hearing this from the outside, what would you be thinking right now? Would you hear this as speculation? Or would it sound like someone describing something that they already knew and definitely knew? I stopped and asked slowly, I'm going to ask you again, do you know my ex? And he said, I'm just speaking hypothetically. And again, I didn't believe him, but I also didn't know why. Then he looked at me and he said, let's say all this is true. Then he hid a lot of money under your kids. And this is why he fought in the way that he did for custody, because whoever has the kids has. My eyes opened wide and I finished the sentence with him. Has the money? He said yes. Again, I asked him, wait, are you telling me this or are you just speculating? A few seconds later in the conversation, he said something else. You should talk this over with your two friends in the UK. I froze because I did have two friends in the UK and they were among the only people I was praying with at that time. But this is something I had never told him. So I repeated back to him, are you telling me that you know I have two friends in the UK? Or are you speculating again? He laughed and said, well, people like where you're from always have friends in the UK. And that's when it became clear. It wasn't that he knew things about me. By then, that was obvious. What unsettled me was how he knew them, and the way he let me know that he knew. He offered just enough detail to raise my suspicion, and then would deflect just enough to make it sound coincidental. It was definitely intentional, like someone testing how much they could reveal without ever saying the quiet part out loud. That day that he told me the PPP story, in the morning, I had been immersed in 1 Samuel, the story about David at Ziklag. David returned to Ziklag to find his wife and children had been taken. His men were distraught and even thought about stoning him. And scripture says that David encouraged himself in the Lord and went after those who had been kidnapped. Along the way, they encounter an Egyptian slave left to die, unfed for 3 days. David feeds him, helps take care of him, and that same man ends up pointing David directly to the enemy's camp, where his wives and children had been taken. God used an unlikely messenger to restore something. I remember after reading that, Lord, send me an Egyptian. Send me someone who will point me to where the enemy is. So when Teppo spoke, I wondered, is he the Egyptian or is he the diversion? I didn't know enough about PPP loans to reason through it. What finally pushed me into fear was the mentioning of my friends. I waited days before calling one of them, and when I told her, she listened but didn't seem to grasp the gravity of what I was saying, and I was left alone with all of that. You know what those conversations felt like? Extreme gaslighting. Like when someone is in your face telling you they did it, but because they're using vague language, you can't pin it on them. It felt the same way as when in season 1 I shared the kid's father walked into the house and kissed my daughter right on the mouth after the night before, finding her lying on him in a compromised position. That's what this felt like. It's when you see someone doing something and instead of denying it, they do the very thing that points to their guilt. This conversation felt like that. He could hide behind speculative language, but it felt like he was telling me something, telling me what he knows, telling me who he knows, telling me who I'm with, and I don't believe it was just him. I believe he was sent. It felt like there was a larger pattern at play, possibly connected to the court case. The confusion wasn't whether something was happening, it was how it could be happening and for what purpose. In intelligence work, one of the oldest techniques isn't interrogation, it's familiarity. Decoys are sent in to mirror your beliefs, your language, or partial information about you, not necessarily to extract facts directly, but to watch how you respond, to see if you will confirm it, correct it, flinch, or push back. That reaction establishes access. This is also one of Satan's oldest strategies against believers. He doesn't always come in as an obvious threat. He comes as something familiar, something that feels safe enough to let your guard down. We see this clearly in Numbers 25. When a sorcerer couldn't curse the people of God, they would use seduction instead. That seduction led to being covenanted to other gods, and that covenant led to defilement, and the judgment followed afterwards. And as a side note, what has always struck me about that story in Numbers 25 is where all of it happened, in the acacia grove. That detail feels intentional, almost like a signal, because this same pattern repeats across occult systems, especially family-based ones. If you can't destroy someone head-on, you infiltrate relationally. So no, I never believed that this person was random. And I don't believe that he was alone, which brings me to the next person that I quote-unquote met during that time. Because not every strategy comes disguised as a lover. Some come disguised as a friend. Not long after this, I met person number 2. Let's call him Elle. He didn't come in as a romantic interest, but as a so-called quote-unquote spiritual peer. The connection was quick. One morning, I was working in a coffee shop, ironically working on this podcast, when he noticed the book I was reading. He looked at the cover and asked me casually, "Are you in the prophetic?" I turned the question back to him and asked, "Well, what do you think? What is God telling you?" He paused and nodded, "Yes, I think you are." I laughed and asked if he was a prophet, and he said no, but added that he was more of a teacher. What stood out wasn't his language itself, but how he spoke without hesitation and familiarity. Within minutes, he had identified me spiritually. Over the course of that first conversation, he mirrored my sense of calling and expressed my immediate interest in ministry, aligning himself with my vision, almost reflexively. What followed were long conversations about purpose and faith and doing ministry on the continent. And at first, it felt encouraging, but two things quickly became apparent. First, the story he shared about himself followed a very specific narrative that I had heard before. Being one of many siblings, feeling excluded, trapped in family dynamics he claimed he couldn't navigate. What raised concern weren't just the themes, but the precision, the emotion, the phrasing, the way the story was framed. These weren't patterns I had heard broadly or repeatedly in my own life. They were details I had only ever encountered in one place, and that was my marriage. It felt as though the story closely mirrored my children's father in structure and substance, so closely that it was impossible to dismiss as chance. Secondly, over time, he began using a very recognizable dynamic. Long connecting conversations that would be followed by abrupt withdrawal. Periods of intensity would give way to prolonged silence. The pattern repeated. It didn't feel casual, it felt deliberate, like a bait and hook strategy designed to create psychological pull and provoke someone to pursue. That immediately registered as a red flag. As conversations continued with him, he revealed more about his character. He talked openly about entering relationships with women primarily because they supported him financially, or because they were willing to fund travel, offer favors, or invest in him. At one point, he even said he would consider marrying someone if she could fund his lifestyle and invest in his ministry. When he shared these stories, I would challenge him. I would name the manipulation. I pushed for accountability, and I pointed out how those behaviors harmed people. And when I did that, and also when I stepped back from the conversations with him, the connection would collapse. But that wasn't the end. Around the same time, I was introduced to person number 3, Kola, through work that my father was organizing in South Africa. That particular detail will matter later, so keep listening. Although he introduced himself as an engineer, he also described himself as a pastor and a teacher. What we connected on was mostly about ministry, what God was doing prophetically in that part of the country. Many of the same themes that had surfaced with person number 2, Elle. Like the encounter before him, it felt as though he had been given a kind of brief about me, an understanding of how to generate connection and sustain it when needed. Because I met him through work that my father was organizing, my guard was completely down. He presented himself as a spiritual mentor, a listening ear, someone who was always available. Call anytime, even if it's late, he would say. That alone crossed a boundary I would normally never ignore. I had always been strict about not calling or messaging people too late, and yet somehow that boundary began to blur. I shared aspects of what had happened in my case, and he would respond as though he understood, like these spiritual undertones were familiar to him, like he got it. He would mirror those details back to me, or share similar stories he claimed to have heard firsthand from other people who he had helped through similar situations. I felt he was doing this as a way to keep the conversation going and to establish some sort of spiritual credibility with me. And just like with Elle, the same bait and hook pattern would emerge. There would be absence, then reappearance. Absence, and then reappearance. Over time, it became clear that his role was not to really be helpful, but to maintain conversation, to keep information flowing, to preserve proximity without outcome. I wasn't drawing conclusions yet at the time. I was taking notes. Looking back at all 3 people together, a blueprint becomes impossible to ignore. First, with all 3, there was the quote-unquote random but scripted access, a draw, and a sense of quick familiarity. There was spiritual language that was used immediately, and there was this rapid identification of being in ministry. Second, there was this sense of a tailored connection. Each person carried a narrative that was familiar, one I had heard before or known before, very specifically. ministry, Africa, calling, or narratives I'd helped other people through, family wounds. It felt less like coincidence and more like a briefing, as if someone had known details of past interests, relationships, or friendships. Third, they used conversation as access. All three had intense times of talk, then pull away. It seemed like the intent was to create an emotional and psychological hook designed to make one pursue. None of this was random. This was spiritual grooming, and it mirrors exactly what we see in Numbers 25. Defilement doesn't begin with idolatry. It begins with proximity, with conversation, and with agreement. And the danger is that when people come as friends or peers, we often drop our vigilance. There's more to this story, but let's keep going. Now, up until this point, all the strange moments had all involved people. Around this time, I was working on a routine application and they needed information from my passport. I grabbed my passport, opened it, and that's when I realized that something was wrong. The entry stamp in my passport from when I came into the country wasn't for the standard 60 or 90 days. It was stamped for 29 days. Now, this was odd. I have traveled internationally throughout my whole life, alone, with my children, across multiple continents, and nothing like that had ever happened to me. And by the time I'm looking at this, those 29 days had already passed. At the same time, I was preparing to apply for an in-country extension because of some work that my father was going to be doing in country and had asked me to be a part of. So I contacted an immigration professional to correct the stamp and help me file the extension. And that's when everything stalled. Literally days from when I contacted this person, South Africa issued a moratorium, a freeze on processing expats' visas and travel documents. The advice I was given at that time was don't leave the country until everything had been resolved, or it would look like I'm exiting the country and I have overstayed my stamp. So, in other words, it felt like I was stuck. She advised me that I could move within South Africa, but I probably shouldn't leave it yet until everything was corrected. This meant no quick trip back home, and even if I wanted to go to a different country, no trips there either. Someone else's error had turned into an open-ended stay with no timeline for resolution. And that's when the weight of all of this really hit me. I don't think this was just about strange encounters anymore. It literally felt like there was a literal boundary that had seemed to close in around me. Paperwork, red tape, and the bureaucracy of waiting for expat visas to be processed. And beneath it all, I felt something else. Control. All of this felt engineered, like circumstances had aligned to keep me in one place, suspended in limbo, interacting with only certain people in only certain places. It was in that suspended state, unable to travel out, that the next encounter would take place. During this time, after about a week of feeling locked inside my apartment, I started to feel restless. I knew I needed to get out, do something, do anything. So, oddly enough, that day, I decided to go and get a piercing. I had had piercings before, and so I felt so unlike myself that I thought, let me do something that feels like me, something familiar. So I took a car downtown to a piercing salon, and that's when things got strange. When I arrived, I told them I was there for a piercing, and the woman in front told me to sit in the back room and that I would be called when they were ready. As I waited, a few minutes later, a heavy-set woman walked into the same area. She crossed straight through the room and then went out the back door of the property, which had a small garden area leading to what looked like an outdoor bathroom. She stood in that garden area on her phone, pacing back and forth. The space had large windows, so I could see her very clearly. At one point, she stopped pacing, and I could see that she was staring at me. She came back inside, sat down, and paused, as if she was focusing, and then she turned towards me with the biggest smile. "I am so sorry," she said. "I was so rude. I didn't greet you when I passed through." And I remember thinking, I don't even know you. I brushed it off and said, no worries. But she kept looking at me like she was searching for a way to keep the conversation going. Then she said, "You look like you're not from here." And that struck me as odd because we were the same race, very similar features, and yet she seemed intent on placing me from elsewhere. She started bringing up the US, mentioning it more and more. I was feeling the natural urge to engage, but something in me pulled back. I literally felt a check in my spirit. Stay quiet. Since she was asking questions about the US, I asked her if she had been to the US and if she had family. She mentioned 2 states where she does. And what was odd were those 2 states were actually places where I have lived and have family. Now, in that moment, one can say this was coincidence, but if you're thinking about this as engineered conversation, it felt like it was something designed for me to respond to and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm from that place. I have family there." But again, I felt that same check and I stayed quiet. When she saw that I didn't respond, she then asked me, "Well, why are you here in South Africa?" And I asked her, "Well, why can't I be?" She chuckled along. She began telling a story about having worked in a particular European country that holds a deep meaning for me because I grew up learning the language when I was in grade school. The conversation felt laced with buzz topics and familiar touch points, all designed to pull me in, to make me open up. But because I didn't take the bait, I could feel that she was growing frustrated. But oddly enough, she would continue speaking. The more she spoke, I began to feel a literal agitation in my spirit. I sensed spiritual warfare. I excused myself and crossed out to the back door and went to the bathroom outside and began to pray intensely. I prayed in tongues. I started speaking scripture. I began to even worship. And after 10 or 15 minutes, I came out. The woman who had been eager to engage now had a very cold expression, and her open body posture facing toward me was now completely turned away from where I was sitting. I knew then that that prayer had struck something. Whatever spirit she was carrying was not aligned with mine. Moments later, an employee would come back to the back and look at both of us. He asked, "What are you 2 doing back here?" I said, "Well, I've been waiting all this time to be called for my piercing." He checked the board, saw my name, and immediately apologized and said, "I'm so sorry. We'll get you settled right away." And then he turned to the woman and he said, "What are you doing back here?" She stated she was there to buy jewelry. He looked confused and said, "But this isn't where you would be sent if you were buying jewelry. All the jewelry is in the front right when you walk in. You would have seen it immediately." The woman began to stutter. I asked and they told me to come back here." The man shook his head vigorously. No one working today would have told you that. All the jewelry for sale is in the front." And in that moment, I knew this woman was not confused. She was back here because I was back there. She too had been sent. The employees eventually pulled me aside to get my piercing and then escorted her out. And once again, I had that unmistakable knowing in my body that none of this was random.
By this point, the strategy was no longer abstract. If the enemy can't remove you, they try to contain you, distress you, defile you. And just months into the country, Elle was stuck, geographically, relationally, inside a series of engineered encounters that could no longer be brushed off as coincidence. These were patterns, the same kinds of people, different places, the same lines of questioning, the same pressure points. At a certain point, randomness stops being a reasonable explanation. It felt like something was being revealed again and again. Will you trust what you're seeing, or will you keep second-guessing it? Separate moments, the same undercurrent. And if they weren't random, then one question rose above the rest. What was the connecting line? And quietly, uncomfortably, another question followed. Who was close enough to place her there in the first place?
So now, fast forward. It's July of 2024. I had been in South Africa for 6 months and my visa situation was still unresolved, and there was a growing sense of uncertainty of when it would still be handled. My dad arrived in country for the work I mentioned earlier. He was hosting a large conference that was separate from the job offer that I referenced before, and he asked me to lead a section of it for the youth. There were going to be several hundred people flying in. He had been there briefly in February for the early groundwork, and now he was back again for the actual event in July. I was excited about the event, but more than that, I was just glad to see my dad. And when we met for dinner, it felt nice, like a sense of normality, like something familiar. We sat there talking and small talk. He would ask how things were going. And then, almost casually, like it was an afterthought, he said, "Oh, your brother told me you had an encounter with someone here in South Africa. Is that true?" I was shocked. I had told my brother what happened, but I assumed my dad didn't know. Because if he had, he would have called and asked me. But he hadn't. What unsettled me was this. My dad and I had been talking during this time, more than once, and still, he never mentioned it. My stomach did a small drop. I asked him why he hadn't said anything before, why he hadn't brought it up. But instead of answering me, he sidestepped it to ask a question. "Well, can you give the name of the person?" That question stopped me, mostly because of what it skipped. It wasn't asking what happened, are you okay, is this why you needed to move so quickly? It felt more like a data question, the kind of question when you're trying to place someone, not when you're trying to understand what happened to your child. I remember thinking, if I say the name, will you know who they are? But still, I told him generally what happened, how I met the person, the patterns I began to notice, and the kinds of questions that person was asking me. My dad would just sit there, listening and saying very little. It wasn't how I had ever known him to respond to anything like this before. There was no concern, there was no panic, there was no urgency. He was just listening. What stayed with me was this. You mean you've known this for 3 or 4 months already and you never said anything to me? I couldn't shake that. Eventually, the conversation shifted. He began telling me that I needed to move again. I should go from place to place, go from hotel to hotel, 1 day here, 3 days here, 5 days somewhere else. I know he wanted to bring safety, but honestly, that sounded a bit erratic. We talked a bit more, and when we parted ways for the night, he went to his hotel, and I would go back to my apartment. I just remember this heavy weight in my gut. I couldn't see the full picture yet, but something wasn't right. The next day, the pre-events for the conference were set to begin. Not where I was staying, but in another part of the country. People were already flying in for the pre-festivities, and I was supposed to be flying in as well. But, oddly enough, I would miss my flight. That alone was strange. I don't miss flights like that. But I tried not to overthink it. The flights were frequent enough where I could just try again for the next day. And the next day, I would miss the same flight again. By the third time of missing the flight, I started paying attention and I started praying, God, what is this? I don't miss flights like this. Why can't I get there? 3 days after I was supposed to have arrived, I finally made it to the conference location. By then, though, I had missed all of the pre-activities. And looking back now, I know that God was likely keeping me from something. But the question is, from what? On my first day at the conference site, my dad started to introduce me to colleagues. We agreed to keep things professional. So he didn't mention to many people that I was his daughter. He introduced me as a consultant and addressed me by my title. As we moved through the introductions, he talked about people he had already met and meetings that he felt had gone well. At one point, he pulled me aside and pulled out a picture on his phone. He was showing me a picture from a group of people who he had had dinner with the night before I had arrived. He pointed to a man in the group and said, "This person is doing some exciting work. I think you should meet him, spend some time with him, get to know him." Therein enters person number 4. Let's call him Ade. My dad continues, "I even think he's about your age. I don't think he's married, so maybe you can talk to him as well." The comment was odd, but after the summer I had had so far, honestly, I just ignored it. I wasn't looking for that kind of connection. Later, at the opening dinner for the festivities, my dad began introducing me to some of the guests, and among the first was that man from the photo. He was quite tall. The minute I looked up to say hello, I felt dizzy, and I felt sharp, piercing sounds fill my ears, like the air had thinned. My head was spinning so much that I even looked down and had to shake my head a bit. For as crowded as the lobby was, it felt like everything went silent for a moment. The people around us seemed to part ways, as if the room had cleared. Suddenly, it was just he and I standing there. It was one of the strangest sensations I had ever experienced. This wasn't about feelings. It was something else, something that I didn't understand yet. The wooziness felt familiar. It reminded me of the same fog that I felt around person number 1, Teppo. Something else about the feeling reminded me of a dream that I had had almost a year earlier, long before I even knew that I was going to be in South Africa. So in this dream, I'm in South Africa with my dad, and we are having breakfast at a hotel lobby. In walks another man and his son. The fathers began talking, and then naturally, the guy and I began to speak too. Later in the dream, I was out running errands. In the dream, I was looking at houses, and the man asked if he could come along or meet me afterward, and I agreed. After that part in the dream, my dad was preparing to leave South Africa. Before he left, the man's family would call him over, convincing him that the two of us should be together. And in the dream, my dad agreed. Then he called me and told me that I should be with this man. That was the end of the dream. The dream came back to mind forcibly in that moment, and I too almost shook my head as if to shake it away and shake the fog away, and I tried to ignore it for the rest of the night. Looking back, all of that wooziness, the fog, the sharp piercing sounds in my ear, it felt like some kind of manipulation in the air. That's the best way I can explain it. For the rest of the evening, there was a lot of mingling and small talk with people. I was speaking with several people, but there was a noticeable amount of one-on-one conversation between me and this guy. Where are you from? What kind of work do you do? What are you into? Then the questions would shift. He started asking me very specifically where I was going after this conference. Where would I be? What town would I be staying in? That stood out because we had just met and there was no reason for that level of detail. Then he mentioned his plans, how he wanted to go specifically shark cage diving while he was there in the country. Now, listen, I don't like sharks, but something about that grabbed my attention. It was the uniqueness of his interest. After the first night, the main event, everyone retired to their hotel rooms. And at some point that night, this particular man and I began texting. It began innocently enough. Hey, it was good to meet you. Here's my contact. What are you up to? He would go on to say that he was up and still working. He then started to share pictures of his desktop, pictures of how his desk was set up, pictures of what he was drinking, screenshots of the music he was listening to. As the conversation went on, the question shifted. Are you dating anyone? Do you have kids? Do you like kids? How do you like South Africa? Then came the suggestions. Maybe we could link up together after the conference, if you're free. He said he was planning to go, ironically, to the same town I was headed to after the conference. He mentioned again about going shark cage diving and that I should go with him. I told him I wasn't sure about that. Maybe I could just watch from afar. I was headed to that town because I had a couple of appointments set up to look at houses. And in that moment, the dream came back to mind. In that dream, I was in South Africa looking at houses. And while we were on the phone, he purchased his hotel and his flight to the town that we were headed to afterward. There would be more talking. It was clear that there was a sense of flirtatious banter between the two of us. And then suddenly, and I don't even know why in the moment, I asked him the question. It just flew out of my mouth. Are you married? Even when I asked it, I was surprised at myself because there was nothing that he had given off that would have indicated that he was married. He laughed for a bit and then he said, "Oh, is it only single people that can have fun?" The way he answered, really the way he didn't answer, immediately shifted the conversation. 5 minutes, 10 minutes would go by, and he still hadn't answered my question. That told me everything I needed to know. By then it was late, and I still had my own work to finish, so I said I needed to get off the phone, and we ended the conversation. The next day we spoke again, and I asked him again, "Are you married?" And that time he admitted that he was. So I asked him directly, "So then why are you talking to me then?" From there, I needed to reassess because the whole situation was now strange. He was openly coming on to me, and this was someone that my dad had specifically told me to connect with. And even though I wasn't interested in anything flirtatious, there was still a professional overlap. We still had to work in the same environment. It was an awkward position of competing feelings. After that conversation, I pulled all the way back. I just stopped engaging with him. Even at one point, when he was giving a keynote at the conference, he texted repeatedly to see if I would be in attendance. I said I would, but then later just did not show up. That's how I stayed for the rest of the week. Let it pass by, brief hellos, polite distance, and nothing more. So we get to the end of the week, and it's the end of the conference. He knew that I was going to be flying out to another town, and he had those same travel plans as well. On the last night of the conference, I was in my hotel room working on this podcast, actually, and I had ordered dinner, so I was going downstairs to go and pick it up. When I got to the lobby, there were a few people also from the conference there. I stopped for a bit and we chit-chatted how everything went, how successful everything was. Everything was normal and light. As we were wrapping up, Ade came downstairs and joined the conversation. Then someone in the group said, "Hey guys, it's the last night. We should all go out." They pointed to a spot right next door, an outdoor area with restaurants and lounges, somewhere to go before everyone flew out the next day. Honestly, I hesitated. I had only just come down to grab my dinner and go back upstairs. But they kept saying, "Hey, come on. It'll be fun. Just one last night. Just go and change real quick. It won't be a big deal." But again, my spiritual guards were down. These were people connected to my dad's work, people that I believed were safe. After a few minutes of back and forth, I just said, "Okay, why not?" I told myself I had been focused all week. The place is right next door. We're not getting into a car. If I needed to leave, I could just walk back to the hotel. That was my reasoning. I grabbed my dinner from the hotel restaurant real quick, went upstairs, changed quickly, and came back down, and we walked over as a group together. At first, it was okay. Not really my vibe, but I told myself, just be open. Almost immediately, someone said, "Well, since you're the lady, why don't you choose what we all will drink?" I said, "I don't really drink anymore, and honestly, I wouldn't even know what to choose." Then the waitress came over. She was very animated and said, "Yes, mommy, you're the one who's going to choose what everyone is going to drink." They told me, "Just choose anything. Whatever you choose, everyone is going to drink." And I remember thinking, this is so stupid. I don't even know what all this stuff is. I looked at the menu and then looked along the wall at the bottles of drink lined up there. And to be honest with you, I chose something purely because of the color. It was a pretty amber brown. I had no idea what it was. And when it arrived at the table, some of the men at the table tried to explain what it was. They suggested that I take a small shot. I took one and immediately thought, whoa, I do not like this at all. So I set it aside and I asked for a glass of wine, a glass that I could sip very slowly over the course of the night. While the others drank, I focused on keeping the night light and friendly. I wasn't engaging with Ade. I was just talking with the others in the group, trying to keep things fun, casual, non-flirtatious. I thought the night would end just like that. But when we finally left, I suddenly started to feel off. I felt it a little bit before we actually left the restaurant. My head would feel mushy. I would start to feel woozy. I was trying to hold myself together. I hadn't eaten anything, and I only had that glass of wine. And one glass of wine had never made me feel like that. I remember trying to steady myself, but my behavior shifted slightly. Not hyper, but just not entirely myself. We were walking back to the hotel, and I got in the elevator. At this point, Ade and I were talking mid-conversation, and then suddenly he walked off the elevator. I asked, "Oh, are you getting off there too?" He said, "Yeah, come with me." Looking back, this is the moment Elle should have stayed on the elevator. She should have gone straight to her room. I acknowledge that. I know I wasn't operating with the clearest of judgment. And yes, it could have looked like the wine, but I know that one glass of wine never made me feel like this. So we got off the elevator and we entered his room. We talked for a bit and it escalated quickly. At this point, I need to be honest. What happens next is difficult to tell and maybe difficult to hear. Things became physical very quickly. We were making out, and then we ended up on the bed. At one point, he grabbed me and started moving me from the head of the bed towards the foot of the bed. At first, I thought he was just repositioning himself, making room for his legs. But then he kept scooching me closer and closer to the edge. One more scooch, and I was right at the edge. Another scooch, and I was nearly off the bed. He was holding me from behind, and I was literally almost falling off. And then, boom! He scooched me right off the bed and onto the corner of a table that was at the foot of the bed. My head hit it. In that moment, I expected to hit the floor, but I didn't expect the table. Right before impact, I felt a sudden warmth over my head, like it was two hands that were cupping my ears and holding my head from behind. All the sound around me vanished, and then I would hear the crack and a sharp sound of my head hitting the table. It felt like something had insulated my head from what should have been a devastating blow. I lay still for a moment. What had just happened? What was he doing? Did he do that on purpose? I lay still for a bit before asking out loud. And then he said, are you okay? I said, yeah, but what were you doing? He got up and mumbled, I don't know. He exhaled and then carried me back onto the bed. To be honest, I don't remember much after that. The last thing I remember was him atop of me, and that's where my body was heavy and my mind was fuzzy. The next clear thing I remember was the overwhelming sensation that I needed to use the bathroom. I opened my eyes and the room now was completely black, pitch black. For a moment, I even didn't remember where I was. I looked over and saw a clock on the nightstand. It read either 4:44 or 4:14. Almost 7 hours had passed. I tried to get up, and my body felt impossibly heavy, heavier than before. I tried again, and I had to lay back down. My head was pounding. And then I heard a voice say, "Get up and go, now." I was so out of it that I responded out loud. I said, "But I can't get up. My head is pounding. How can I get up?" The voice said again, "Get up and go now. We will hold your head for you." The room was completely dark. I couldn't see my clothing. I couldn't see my bag. So I just started feeling around on the floor. Finally, I found my dress, I found my boots, my purse, and my phone. There was a small pool of light that seemed to now appear on the floor area. Honestly, I don't know where it came from, but it was just enough. I got dressed as quickly as I could. From the moment I woke up to leaving the room, it couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 minutes. I didn't even look at him. I didn't say anything. I just left. I felt like I could have collapsed at any second, like I might just sink straight into the floor. But that voice kept repeating, "We will hold your head for you. Just get up and go now." Holding my shoes in my hand, I exited the room and somehow found my way back to my room. When I look back on it now, nothing in me should have been able to even do that. My head was pounding so heavily. I felt sick. The room was spinning, and I kept thinking, what is making me feel this way? One glass of wine could not do this. I got back to my room and I just lay down. And after coming out of all that darkness, all I wanted was light. I turned on all the lights in my room and I even opened the curtains. My computer was still on. What I was working on was still there. And I just started to weep. I cried aloud to God, "God, what have I done?" And then immediately I asked myself, what was done to me? Both thoughts hit me at once. I didn't feel like myself, and this wasn't how my body would respond to a glass of wine. Something wasn't right. I had traveled with one of my youngest daughter's little pillows, and I remember staring at it and holding it in that moment. And over again, I would just ask myself and cry, what have I done? What was done to me? Nothing about that night felt right. I finally fell asleep and woke up a few hours later in the morning, still wondering what had really happened. Again, it was the last day of the conference, so this was the day everybody was supposed to be flying out, and I was also supposed to be flying out for the appointments that I had mentioned before. I got out of bed, got dressed, and packed a small bag, and just tried to push everything in the back of my mind. I needed to focus and just make this flight. But even as I dressed, I remember just feeling out of it. I felt ashamed, and I felt scared. Ashamed because how had I ended up there? And scared because what had really happened after I can't remember? Why had he pushed me off the bed like that? I still felt dazed and impaired by something that I couldn't name. As I packed my book bag, I realized I hadn't received a check-in text for my flight. So I started to pull up my flight info to just go ahead and manually check in. And that's when I saw there was no ticket. That's impossible. I know I bought this ticket. I called the airline and they confirmed there was no record of a ticket being held for me. And that's when I knew again that this was God. He was keeping me from something. Instead of rebooking immediately, I just decided to stay put and just spend the last 2 days there with my dad before he flew back to the States. I suddenly now had a free morning, and so I decided to just go and have breakfast at a cafe in town. When I took a car in town and got to the street where the cafe was, something odd happened. And I'm mentioning it because maybe some of you listening may have an insight as to what this may mean spiritually. I got out on the road and there was literally a gang of monkeys in the street. When I turned the corner, it seemed like all of them turned towards me at one time and started to rush towards my way. I remember just rushing into the cafe and thinking, what the crap was that? I had been in South Africa all this time and had not seen animals like that. I sat down at the table and I cried and prayed, and I tried to process it all. The shame I was feeling was so heavy that honestly I couldn't really process the rest of it. I mostly felt crushed by God, by myself. And worst of all, I feared that that night had somehow would impact my children. Like, now that I had broken trust with God, would He no longer protect my children? Would He no longer protect me? I wondered aloud, would He still hear my prayers when I pray for my kids now? That thought alone tormented me more than anything. I was grieved and conflicted and desperate, and the only thing I knew to do was to confront it. I finished my breakfast quickly and I did something that I still don't know if it was the right thing to do, but it was how my mind and heart were still trying to make sense of what happened. I took a cab back to the hotel and I went back to Ade's room and I asked to speak with him for a moment. I told him plainly, I need to apologize to you. I shouldn't have come back to your room last night. You don't really know me, but if you did know me, you would know that anything I did with you is completely out of character for me. I don't just represent myself, I represent Christ, and what happened last night is not who I am or who I want you to know me as. This isn't something I do. It's not any way that I would act. I remember feeling deep remorse as I said it, and I was shaken and I was sincere. I was trying to take responsibility for myself. Looking back, I was hoping that he would also do the same, but his response was the opposite. He was flippant, almost playful, like it was nothing. He brushed it off like it was nothing and then casually asked me, did you eat breakfast? When did you leave last night? Were there lights on when you left? The contrast was jarring. I was sitting there with all of this shame and confusion, and he seemed completely unaffected, unbothered, and almost amused by it all. Then he said something that stopped me. He said, this is how people end up on the evening news. It would have been something like woman found dead in a man's room, and they would have hauled me away to prison for murder. I just stared at him. Then I realized that he was referring to hitting my head on the table last night. Looking back on that today, what he had just said felt like a confession, like he was telling me what was actually meant for me that night. I remember I cleared my throat. If I had really understood in that moment what that was, I would have left immediately. I asked him, what were you doing? Why were you pushing me off the bed like that? He responded by saying he was trying to reposition himself and then he just didn't know what happened. And then he changed the subject abruptly. He asked if I was getting ready to head out for my flight. When I told him what happened about my ticket, he looked up slowly and seemed shocked. He asked me if I had known that my ticket was not there just that morning or if I had known before. It was an odd question, but I told him that I had just learned about it this morning. The conversation ended shortly afterward. I left him to finish packing and I headed back to my room. He flew out later that day to continue on to the next town. And the next few days, I stayed in the hotel. I hung out with my dad and then slept a lot. I remember feeling overwhelmingly tired still, like a bone-deep exhaustion. I couldn't explain it. 2 days later, my dad flew home and everyone else had already gone. I was alone again. When I finally flew out and made it to the next town for the appointments I mentioned, Ade was still in town. He had canceled all the plans he had talked about before. He invited me to lunch, and against better judgment, I agreed. I still had too many questions about that night. I was caught between two opposing forces, remorse for going, and a deep need to understand what had actually happened. And I still had to work with him because of a project that my dad had looped all of us in. Spending time with him didn't bring clarity. If anything, it made things worse. During one of the meals that we were having, we were sitting outside when something in me suddenly sharpened, like a fog had lifted all at once. I looked at him and I asked him very directly, "Who sent you?" He didn't blink and he looked right back at me. He said, "Your village people sent me." And then he repeated, "Your village people sent me. They came to me and asked if I could come for you." I stared at him. He stared back. No smile, no hesitation. We stood there like that for a full minute. You know that moment where someone's trying to joke with you, but you know that they're telling you the truth, but you also have no idea what you're supposed to do with it? Because if what he said was true, then none of this was random. It never had been. What I know now is this. He had just handed me a clue, a truth veiled as something dismissible, something easy to laugh off, something I would replay in my mind for months afterwards. And later, only later, I would realize he had named something real, long before I was ready to see it.
Elle didn't yet understand it as abuse. Only later would the question surface. Were those encounters truly consensual, or were they engineered? And when harm comes, the blame is inverted, leaving the woman carrying shame that was never hers. The last man said it was her village, her family. But was that truth or a distraction? Because what Elle didn't know yet is that this story doesn't end with strangers. It leads back to bloodlines and to the unsettling possibility that she had wandered into something that had been there all along.
Hey you, thanks for listening. If you've known abuse, assault, loss, or fear, and most especially if you're protecting a child, your voice matters. Stay alert, stay listening, and trust the Holy Spirit when He nudges you forward. We'll meet you in the next episode.